All right, so welcome to this presentation. In this presentation, we want to understand how we can make valid conclusions following our evaluation. So, for example, we have now collected our data and we have done the analysis, and now we are making interpretation of the data findings. So we make conclusions about the findings that we have. The findings that we have termed as the evidence. So we want to make conclusions, or we want to make judgments about the evidence. So in this presentation, we are basically looking at this in two angles. The first angle is if you are presented with an evaluation report, you are going to read the evaluation report and reach the section that has the conclusion. So in that section for the conclusion, you will make a judgment on whether the conclusions are valid or not valid. Whether you can use the conclusions to continue with the project or suspend the project or change the project, change the approaches or the intervention strategies for the project or program. Okay. So that is the first angle we are looking at. The other angle we are going to look at is if you are the one who is making these, who is drawing this conclusion, what things do you have to take into consideration? So in my explanation, I'll be using perspectives from those two angles. So first of all, you need to note that the evidence can come from an evaluator who has used the data that is qualitative or quantitative in nature. Quantitative data is basically numeric data, and then qualitative data is descriptive or narrative, or data that basically explores experiences of people. Okay, so you have the combination of those. So the person can have within the same report qualitative and quantitative evidence. Each of those possess advantages and disadvantages. So they might have sat down and then use different data collection tools, questionnaires, observation, and other measurements. And then they went out and looked for all this information or evidence. When the person does that, that is primary data. But if they sat down and then looked for reports from the health facilities, the annual reports on health, and other relevant literature that is very vital, or that literature that is relevant to the health program, then we say that they have gotten the information from secondary sources. Now, how do you evaluate this evidence that is actually presented to you? Because they use the evidence to infer or to come up with conclusions. Okay, so how do you assess the evidence? You basically need to assess the evidence, and then you can now know whether the conclusions are valid or not. You cannot just look at the conclusions without looking at the evidence. So you need to basically look at the nature of the evidence. Basically, you focus on where that evidence comes from. That means that you look at the whole process of generation of this evidence, from the design, the evaluation design, the nature of questions asked, the people who are asked the sample, and then the analysis, and then the way the report is being written, and the conclusion. Basically. So you look at the whole process. But basically, in this aspect, we are looking at some parameters here. One is that the evidence should be relevant to the evaluation questions. Okay, so this means that the evaluator has to make sure that the appropriate evaluation questions are asked. And then they go out and seek for data that answers the evaluation question. Okay, so the evidence should be able to address the evaluation questions and the program goals. Okay, the evaluation questions come from the program goals, and therefore the evidence generated should be linked to the program goals. And then the second issue is about validity. The extent to which the evidence was actually measured. So if we are going to look at a program that was interested in improving the nutritional status of children under the age of 5, and then we have the baseline measurements, and then we determine the prevalence of malnutrition for children under the age of 5. So the baseline could have been determined by using the MUAC, the mid-upper arm circumference, to classify children whether they are malnourished or not malnourished. If we do that, it means that in this case, we are using the appropriate tool of measurement, and it is measuring what is actually supposed to measure. Okay, so for any intervention, you need to look at what are you going to measure and what tool are you going to use to measure. If the tool you're going to use to measure is not the appropriate tool, then it generates invalid results. So if, for example, in this case, we use an adult, a MUAC for adult people, and you are using it for children, then it is invalid. So the tool used to measure the construct should be that is actually intended for that purpose. And then reliability is, if I take the MUAC of 5 children today, and then tomorrow, or just a few hours later, another person comes and takes the MUAC of these 5 children, they should get results that are actually similar. If they don't, then the measurements are not. It is either the problem with the measurement tool, or the problem is with the individuals who are actually taking these measurements. So this brings the issue of reliability. Reliability is if I use the tool and another person comes and uses the same tool in similar circumstances, they should get similar findings. And then the other aspect is what we call timeliness, which is basically the currency and recency of evidence about evaluation. So the intervention can produce results that can be immediate, intermediate, or long-term results. Okay. If you come and gather evidence for an intervention that actually produces results after a longer period of time, and then you collect the data immediately at the start of the intervention, then there is no, this evidence is flouted because the evidence is not related to the impact, because the impact has not yet generated the desired outcome. What is very key is that the evidence should be able to link to the program objectives. Okay, the evidence should be able to link to the program objectives. We use the logic framework or the logic models, or what we termed as the program theory or theories of change, to be able to understand the components of a program in terms of inputs, outputs, the activities, and then the impact. So the evidence that generate should also be able to link, to be linked to all those aspects of the logic model. But the logic models establish the relationships or the links between those components, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impact. And therefore, the appropriate linkage should be made. That means that the appropriate studies should be made. Studies that can link an effect with the cause, what we often call causal inference. You can conduct an evaluation study that basically looks at a given parameter. It can be the prevalence of malnutrition. And then you find out that the prevalence is 15%. But it will not tell you the cause of this prevalence. So for you to be able to understand the factors related to the malnutrition, you should use methods that can reveal the causal effects. So quasi-experimental designs can help us in establishing that relationship. How was the data analyzed? And what are the key things that you need to look at? First, that, of course, the nature of the data that you have determines the analytical, the statistical methods that you're going to use in the data analysis. So if you have descriptive studies, statistics or descriptive data, you're basically going to summarize and describe the main characteristics of this data. This is when you look at the measures of central tendency and then the measures of dispersion. And then the other branch is what you call the inferential statistics, is how you link an intervention with the effect or the impact that it creates based on samples. Okay, if you have a nutrition program, the nutrition program has reached 1,000 children in a school. So you have made a hypothesis that the nutrition program improves the scores in the different subjects. Okay, now you want to test if actually that is true. Okay, so for you to test that, it means you need to get a sample and carry out these tests on those that have the nutrition program, on those that do not have the nutrition program. And then you will see what is the average scores of what are the average scores for these two categories of students. So that is differential statistics. They make a connection between the cause and effect based on hypotheses that you have formulated and also data that you have got from sample. And then the other approach is meta-analysis. You are going to look at the different studies that have been done on the different programs, which are similar, and then be able to reach a conclusion based on studies that are multiple. And then be able to say that such an intervention can result into such an impact or causes such an impact. That is meta-analysis. The approach to analyzing qualitative data is quite different, where we look at the themes, and then themes, concepts like theme generation, concepts like saturation, triangulation. These are concepts in qualitative data analysis. Often, in evaluation studies, we have a combination of the quantitative and qualitative data. So these the qualitative data actually supports the quantitative data. Okay, so what other things do you really need to be aware of? We'd say that the tool that is being used to measure a given construct variable or indicator should be the appropriate one. So we call that validity. So we have an element of internal validity, which is the extent to which an effect that is observed is caused by a systematically planned intervention. Okay, so we can have an intervention, for example, the intervention for a nutrition program for school-going children. And our interest is to see that there is increase in the student enrollment in the school. And then also the performance also increases. So we implement this project for 6 months. And then we look at the enrollment and then the performance. If we have an issue to do with the internal validity, it means that the intervention that we actually implemented did not cause the increase in enrollment or the increase in the scores because of other factors. Maybe the headmaster was changed, maybe the syllabus was changed. So there could be other factors that contribute to student enrollment and student what? Performance as our indicators. So did the impact cause the effect? Or what would have happened if actually the impact was not there? Okay, so that's the question we ask. If the intervention was not there, could we have observed what we have observed? Okay, that's an issue to do with internal validity. We should be aware of 2 things: type 1 error and type 2 error. Type 1 error is for you to say that yes, the student enrollment increased because of the nutrition program, yet indeed there wasn't, what we call a false positive. We can call that false positive. Okay. You need to communicate these findings in a clear way. So your conclusions definitely have to be written in a clear and concise way. Use visual diagrams to illustrate your key issues in your report, because the conclusions naturally follow what you have been presenting. So if you have not presented your work in a very good way, the conclusions may not be understood. It is very important for you to remain a person who is professional enough, and also note that the conclusions that you might have drawn may not be the right ones because of the limitations in your methods, or the way you collected data, or the way you did the analysis. You may even suggest that the evaluation needs further investigation. That is very key. Involve the key stakeholders in writing your report, basically. This is very, very important because they give you feedback that you actually need to refine and validate your conclusions. You need to write good recommendations that are actually relevant, feasible, and actionable. Base your recommendations based on the conclusions that you have. The conclusions are very important because you use them in decision making, especially in designing and modifying programs. Sometimes the conclusions are influenced by a number of factors that we are going to look at, and some of them we have actually looked at them earlier on. One is attrition, which is basically that you enroll people into the study, and then along the way they drop off from the study. So if you started with 500 students, and then you're following up to see the impact of a given project, at the end of the project you have 200, that will distort your findings and therefore your conclusions. You can have other things that are happening outside the intervention that will impact on the project and therefore basically impact on the measurements. So the measurements that you're using, whatever parameter that you have, may either have inflated values or values that are actually going to decrease. The instrument that you use, issues of reliability and validity that I've earlier on explained. Sometimes after following up people for a very long time, you'll have changes that happen to them, either physiological changes over time. And these may be parameters that you're actually interested in, and they definitely influence the outcomes that you're interested in measuring. We have a terminology called regression. If you are looking at individuals and you have selected them based on their scores, over time, you realize that their scores will tend towards what you call the population mean. Okay, so that means that the people with high scores will show lower scores in the post-test, and those with the low scores may show higher scores in the post-test. How you select the participants may introduce what you call selection bias, and that will distort your findings. If you have a smaller sample size, you will have problems in making good conclusions and inferences. You may end up committing type 1 and type 2 errors. And then using the appropriate statistical tests is also very important. That means that you need to understand the right statistical approaches to use. Randomization is very important in eliminating some of the biases that you can have, but there are some concepts that cannot be minimized by randomization. Diffusion and imitation. So usually, if you're going to test for a causal relationship, you will have the intervention group and the control group. But then you don't want them to know whether they are receiving the treatment or they are not. But then over time, they will actually know. So the information that is intended for the treatment group may reach the control group, and then they start behaving in a way that will influence the results. The imitation. And that means that basically you're not going to have difference, or the difference between the treatment and the control group is going to be narrowed. And then we have a concept of compensatory equalization, where the control group is provided or obtains an alternative intervention that results into narrowing the difference between the treatment group and the control group. Okay, depending on what basically is being tested. And then compensatory rivalry, which is that the control group works very hard to rival the intervention group to improve their outcomes. That also minimizes the difference between the treatment and the intervention group. Earlier on, we talked about internal validity, but now we can focus on what we call external validity, which is the extent to which an observed effect can be generalized to other time settings and also populations. For you to achieve that, you need to have a larger sample size, and the population should be heterogeneous, should not be people of similar characteristics. That means that if an intervention in Kenya is able to produce results, good results, if we implement it in South Sudan, it should be able to give us good results. Okay, so to what extent can we apply the findings from a study in one place to another place? That is what we call external validity. So that marks the end of our presentation. If you have any questions, please, you can ask.